I'll tell you a little bit about my friend, Father Bob. He's somebody that I have known for, I'm going to say, at least 25 years. He's a Carmelite priest of over 57 years. He was for 29 years the director of the Society of the Little Flower. Um, I'm so happy to see a lot of old friends on this Zoom call today because all of you know Father Bob was really such a figurehead with NCDC. He was just one of those faces that we all knew and loved, and we miss seeing him on a regular basis. But he is currently the director of the Carmelite Spirituality Center in Darien, Illinois. If you ever find yourself in that neck of the woods, I recommend that you make a visit there. It's a really special place, and you can see a replica of St. Therese's cell. Looks identical to the one in Lisieux, and you can go in and experience that. It's really a powerful presentation. And from here, I'm going to turn it over to Father Bob. He's going to talk to us about following in the footsteps of St. Therese the Little Flower. And our subject is simplicity in a complex world. Father
Right.
Bob?
All right. Well, thank you. I was going to put my habit on and look more official, but sorry, it's next door. My time was different. Anyway, it's good to be with you. I want to talk about Therese. She's one of the big issues of my life. Be honest with you. When I read her in novitiate at the age of 17, 18, I said, God, who in the hell? What am I getting into? Because she seemed overly pious and stuff, overly sentimental, a spoiled brat who needed a shrink. I'll be honest with you. That's where I was at with her. So probably the first 20, 30 years of my speaking and stuff, I didn't do much, but I was asked when I was about 50 to take over the Society of Little Flower, which is our development office, to spread devotion to her and to, fund much of our seminaries and our foreign missions. And I kept saying, I was regional provincial, but my friend was the provincial, and he kept saying, we need you, Bob. You're just too damn proud to fail, so I need you to give me work. Okay. And I kept saying, well, I don't know. And finally, after a 3-day argument, he said, we really need an answer. And again, I was turning 50. I wanted to do other stuff. And finally, I said, well, Quinn, I got to tell you something. I don't even like her. And he's a psychologist. He stared at me and he said, well, learn to, and walked out of the room. That's how I got the job. Well, she did. She really did change my life in a lot of ways, and I'll explain that. But one of the things that she's more very important about, I think, and why she's one of several popes have called her one of the greatest saints of modern time. I think her and Francis, in many of the American churches, there's always a statue of Francis of Assisi and Therese of Lisieux, for lots of different reasons. But I think one of it was she made spirituality real and practical. It wasn't there. She is really one of the great things about her as a prophet is that she grew up in a church that was Jansenistic, not Catholic, got into this Jansenism of the 17th, 18th, 19th century. And a lot of times Jansenism is about an angry God who's really pissed off and angry, and somehow we're never going to keep him happy, and it's all about legalism, and it's all about sexual crimes, and that you were sin, you were everything was a near and proximate occasion of sin, and God was offended. She broke through that, even though she was brought up with that. And I think when the Pope made her a doctor of the church in 1997, the 100th anniversary of her death, he said that the point was she really helped lead the church out of this heretical kind of stuff that we have to be perfect instead of being whole and complete. It's a wonder, and her life is that way. So, just I always want to do that because the Carmelites, if you know anything about us, we were founded out of the Crusades. The Third Crusade, Richard the Lionhearted and Robin Hood and all that stuff. And there were people from Normandy and England, mostly on leading that crusade to the Holy Land. The church had sent them. Everybody was encouraging them to do it. Huge sacrifice to go there. And they got there, and it was like, what's wrong? Well, first of all, they didn't even have Jerusalem. They'd been lost to the Saracens. And war is intrinsically evil. We all know that. You're fighting people one on one in close contact. And so they got so disillusioned by what the nobility was. They got really disillusioned with life and God and themselves. And well, what were they there? Because they were meeting Christians saying, what do you mean you're reclaiming the Holy Land? And I've had ancestors here for 2,000 years that have been following Jesus. But remember the difference, the split between the Greek world and the Roman world and all that stuff. Okay, so as always, they go to Mount Carmel, which is the spring of Elijah, hopefully that he could reignite that divine spark within him. And I think that's always what this is really about. So it's always darkness seeking light, and you'll see much of our spirituality. And she's a good example of it. Probably the best articulation of it is John of the Cross. Many of you have heard of him, who helps you get through how you trust God's presence amid the dark and disillusioning and abandoning times of life. When it all gets dark and where are you, Lord? And what's going on with life? So much we have experience of that. And he really does articulate those stages, that cyclical thing many times. He's a wonderful job. Well, Therese was named after Teresa of Avila, who was the great reformer, and John was her partner. But in fact, she's John of the Cross because she lived with a lot of darkness. And I just want to explain it. I think that's why I think her life makes a lot of sense to people, which I didn't see in a way. There's a lot of things I can go into about Carmelites, but I want to stick on her. So it's a spirituality of trust amid abandonment. Now, she's one of 9 kids born to a man and woman. He wanted to become a monk and she wanted to become a nun, and both were told they couldn't. One for he couldn't master Latin, and the other one she was just a dominant woman, and she is. And so they eventually their thing was to be celibate and give their lives to God. That was their big thing, and that was a big thing in those days. So anyway, they're there trying to do that, and then eventually somebody sets them up on a blind date. They meet each other. She looks at him and says, "Oh, he's a nice guy. He's not going to be abusive." Blah blah blah. Eventually, they get married, and 11 months into the marriage, Zélie, the mother, Zélie Guérin, said, she was talking to the priest that she did a lot. I mean, they were really into all that stuff, a lot, very much so. And she's talking to him, and finally he says, "Did you guys consummate that marriage?" "Oh, no, no, we were chose to be celibate." He said, "Well, I think you better." Well, then they didn't stop, and they have 9 kids. Five of them will live to adulthood. 3 will die in childbirth, and one is important, I think. And then there's one is 5 years old, and they're all the girls. So there's 2 boys and 2 girls will die in childhood, or in their some when the first 3 months, but then now here's one of the issues. It's important. While Therese, who is the 9th child, while Zélie was pregnant with Therese, she lost that one daughter who was 5. It's one thing to lose a baby that you really thought was cute in there, but you haven't connected with, but to know somebody who has a wonderful personality and stuff. So she was going through the trauma of another loss of a child, but that loss was now 5 years old. And so she's born in this times of trauma and worry and darkness, and I think that's important. But what she learned after a while was to trust God in this self-emptying. Uh, Now, there's a lot of things about that I want to get into. One, she was spoiled. So there's now the 5 girls when they're left. And but she was precocious. The mom writes all these letters about her. She was very precocious. She was a bit sick. She had consumption, which we'd call TB in those days. And she kind of commanded, if you're into Enneagram, she's an Enneagram 4. They're special and they need you to be special for them. So anyway, but so she sort of commanded a lot of attention, and they all take care of her. Well, that makes the narcissist just even think more. And her dad always calling her my little queen because she had a great personality. And so there's a lot of different things in there. Probably the first, but is how, and I think one of the things too, and I'll end with that, but is why we know about it. She probably would have disappeared in history because there were so many religious women like that who and I'll explain what happened, why, but anyway, a couple of things are important in her life. The first is she's suffering from a mother abandonment issue. Her mom has her. She's had breast cancer. She's been to Lourdes. She was not healed, but she comes back, and she had used wet nurses before her last 3 kids. So by March, so she's born on January 2nd, 1873. By early March, she goes seven kilometers outside town to this Rose Taillé, who got a big farm out there, a big-breasted woman, as her wet nurse. So she's taken away. Well, but like anybody, you start studying her. It was a hard time because, they know babies know their parents. They were smelling from the inside of their wombs or whatever. So she's out there and she's starting to experience the loss of her mother. But she falls in love with Rose Taillé, who's big breasted. She's got the farm, the dogs. She's out there out in the city. They only came in on Thursdays for provisions, came into town. And even the mom said, My, she's more comfortable with those bumpkins than us. There's a bit of a snobbery in the Guerin and Martin family. So that's it. Okay. So anyway, somebody was by the door. Okay. So anyway, eventually, so they bring her in, but he only sees her. So anyway, eventually, after about 14 months out there, they bring her back. So she's with her family because the mom is getting sicker. And now she's missing Rose Taillé. So she has these strong mother issues going on. And then the mom really bonds with her, and they really spend a lot of time. Her mom is a marvelous woman, but very charismatic, very dominant. She wore the pants in the family. So, well, then 18 months later, the mom dies, and then she goes into. So at the time of that, and of the girls there's a Marie, Pauline, Leonie, Celine, and Therese. Those are the four girls, or the five girls. And the two matched, and the one in the middle, Leonie, who has always been a troubled girl. Every letter their mom writes, poor Leonie. She didn't look good. She wasn't pretty like the rest of them. And anyway, but she was the one that didn't have a partner. But anyway, at the mom's funeral, uh, Celine, who is 2 years older than Therese, goes to Marie and says, "Will you be my mother?" And Therese goes to Pauline and says, "Will you be my mother?" And Pauline steps in and becomes the real dominant mother of her life. She's the one that taught her discipline, stopped being so centered. She's somebody who always needed to be noticed. And she really called her on that. I mean, she taught her the discipline and the love, and really was her confidant for about 6 years. The next 6 years, Pauline is everything. And it's an incredible story because one of the things she did is, and this becomes an important issue in some of her experiences, she really needed to be noticed. Enneagram 3 or 4s they get their value from outside. They need you to notice how special they are. And that's an important issue. But anyway, so Pauline is there, and then suddenly one of the things that occurs during that time is he's talking about becoming a Carmelite nun because the dad moved from Alençon to Lisieux. So he had his brother-in-law was there, and he had some help raising the girls and all that stuff. So anyway, but Pauline leaves. Pauline eventually goes and becomes a nun, and the girls were sent to school. They've been homeschooled until that. So the last two, Celine and Therese, so they sent her to school, and then she comes home, and where's Pauline? Well, she became a nun. Yeah, she didn't realize she didn't live here anymore. So she starts going into a 9 month, what we'd call probably a nervous breakdown, goes into this hissy fits because when you're obsessed with something, I need Pauline, I need Pauline. They can only see her on Thursday afternoons at 2. They were there, and they went up there once or twice, and it was just awful. And there people all want to talk. What's the food like and that stuff. So she felt, and she got in real, and then she turned into a real she wasn't her best self. Let's put it this way. When you get obsessed and you're going to haunt it, and especially if you're spoiled and everybody was supposed to take care of you. So she goes through this 9 month period of real abandonment. And even though Pauline kept saying, we'll always be together, we'll always be together. But what's interesting in that story, and this is something her trying to trust her experience of God, is eventually, and it's bad, the doctors gave up, psychology wasn't there yet. She's a contemporary of Freud. But anyway, but it was Pentecost Sunday, May 13th. Now, this is from October to May. As they were praying, they had a statue to Our Lady of Victory, Mary Victorious, and was praying to her. And suddenly she looks up and she sees the statue smile. Now she's been awful. I mean, everybody. She even writes that she was awful. She told people off, but she went through it. But what's interesting is she had to trust it. Now, here's another piece of that. Just quick, I'm going to lawyer. You know too much. That's the problem. Anyway, so she she's there. So they eventually go up to the convent because the nuns have been listening to her, every Thursday when they were there, and they all want to show up. And she's saying, "What happened? I know the statue. She smiled. She smiled at me. She smiled at me." And because she's looking for affirmation and confirmation. We all wanted that in our experience of the divine. And it was a bad experience in the meantime. So Pauline's still questioning, "Are you sure? Are you sure?" Well, then one of the nuns steps in and says, "Well, she must have had a blue sash." And she's, "I don't know. All I know is she smiled at me." And then the other nun says, "What about gold shoes? Her statues have gold shoes." One of those things. So and Pauline said, she walked away without the affirmation and confirmation that heaven was speaking out to her. And it had to be the divine feminine, because her wound was about a divine feminine, the mother wound. And it's interesting because she's really a good example that God heals what we need, not what we think we want, but that God heals us where we're most needed. And that's an acute thing. So she had to walk away and trust that. A couple other one experiences too is when the dad moved to the zoo and he's fishing and all that stuff. She gets lost away. No, she gets walking around and she gets bored when people are fishing. And she suddenly sees this beautiful plant. She's about 8 years old now. Pauline was still there at the time. But she sees this gorgeous plant and she says, "Wow." Because she went off the beaten path around the lake. You can go there today and this beautiful plant thing. But of course, what is the thing is, what a waste. Nobody sees it. See, when you believe that your value comes from what other people recognize in you or value you. So she's thinking, "Oh, what am I supposed to do? Well, I'd leave it here. I should cut it and put it in a pot so people can enjoy it. Well, she stayed there long enough, and this is her 8 years old. She stays there long enough, and it's the part of her mystical experience is, and that plant, beautiful plant, taught her that it gave glory to God by being, not by doing. See, Jansenism was all these things you had to do to keep God happy. We always think it's about us. Whereas the issue was just by our very being, this God who loves us is there. And that's a huge piece of this mystical experience that the rest of her life. And it gets her through a lot of a lot of different things there. And by Christmas, there's a lot of different things going on there. But another by Christmas then is her conversion. Now, remember, she only lives to be 24. We don't realize that. She's only 9 years in the convent. But one of the interesting things was at Christmas when she was 12, going to be turned 13, I think, or 14. It's halfway through her life. Is the dad had donated? They renovated the cathedral at Notre Dame in Lisieux, and the main altar and they had donated. So they had seats for the midnight mass that always takes place at 8 o'clock. So they were front there, and she went to the manger scene right behind it. And she goes to the baby Jesus and says, "I want to be total for you. I want to be total for you, wholehearted, nothing half-assed, kind of phrase." So she's looking at that. You got to be careful what you think. So she goes that. She gets home. So they finish this. They go home. The maids have created a huge dinner, but she goes in the front door. And when in France, what they do is this, they put their shoes out, and Father Christmas, through their parents, or puts all these candies and stuff. And she says, "I can't wait to see what I'm gonna get." And the dad, who's getting loved her, but saying, "When is she going to grow up? When do you find out it's not about what you get, about what you get?" And so she gets upset again. And she's always had hissy fits. She was prone to that when you see the good psychological studies of her. Anyway, so she starts running upstairs, and suddenly she has an experience, not an apparition of Jesus saying, "Therese, get over yourself. It's not about you." That's a poor English translation. But basically, it's get over yourself. And that's what all conversion is about. And she'll spend the rest of her life doing that. And that whole thing about trusting God and and trusting that Mary was always going to be there, that she had a mother, that even though Pauline and the other ones weren't there. So that's a kind of real important there. But the other piece she's going to break through, so she gets in the convent. It's not at all what she had romanticized about. But she went to the bishop, she went to the pope, she tried everything to get in, and they eventually, through pressure, got in a little bit. And Pauline was in there, and Marie had gone by then. So there's two of her sisters there. Well, it's not at all what she thought it was. You fantasize things, and she had to learn to live, and she was like disillusioned. She had to do a lot of cleaning. They had servants that did all that, and so there was a lot. She had to learn to be where you're planted, of how to accept them there, and live there, and be where you are. Be present to the reality of your life, that sacrament of the present moment. And it was a huge piece of her. But in the process of learning that, especially some of the sufferings, the abandonment stuff she had felt over her life, she begins to understand that this is not an angry, vengeful, judgmental God. This is the God of mercy. And some of the ways he breaks through always is the great loves of your life and the great sufferings of your life. And she began to understand the sufferings, the struggles, the disappointments, the darknesses of life were things that open you up, not put you down, because so many people were there that, it was an interesting thing, but she way before Faustina ever got on this thing, she begins to understand as she had learned from that flower and learned from God and learned from the smiling virgin, the divine feminine, is that God was merciful. He loved us, period. That was like heresy in those days. And we're comfortable with it today because we're moving that way. It's much more gospel based. She read the thing and she had this childlike simplicity. Several of the nuns in that community thought she was an idiot. She was way too childish, way too simple, even though they loved her because when she went they have on Tuesday nights, they had recreation, from 7 to 8. When she came, she was a mimic. Great storyteller and stuff. So, but she taught us that. Now, the other piece is why she didn't get lost here in this thing is that her sickness kept coming back, and she went through a lot of difficult times and how to deal with some of the tough nuns there that really made fun of her and didn't like her, didn't respect her, and even spoke against her canonization. Eventually, I'll tell you why. And so, but what's interesting in there though is one about 2 years before, well, a couple of months before she died. She went into the recreation room, saw that two of the nuns looked at her and said, look, she's getting sick again. The TB's coming back, or because they call it consumption. And what are we going to say about her? She's so simple. Meantime, her cousin is there. She's the woman from the Grand family, and she overhears it. So she goes to Pauline, who is now the prioress, and says, you know what they're saying about her? What are we going to say about her? There's nothing. And Pauline says, I'll take care of it. So Pauline starts with her, waits a week or two in playing, and she says, you're such a great storyteller. We need to know what's going on in your life. And she said, well, I can't do that because it'll make me self-centered again. Remember, my life's not about being so Pauline waits for 2 more weeks and says, I'm not talking to you as your big sister. I'm talking to you as your superior. And I'm telling you under obedience, I want you to start writing down what's happening. And she's, no, I can't do that. But she said, I will write about the mercy of God. So eventually, when she got sick, the last 18 months of her life, she felt a terrible sense of the abandonment by God. Here's somebody who needs it, who wants it. I know what that's like. I've been through some really dark times, and I keep saying, where are you, God? Where are you? And she was certainly doing that, but she came to understand it was there. And so anyway, but then when they then finally, when she got really bad, they saw her one night. It was in July. Uh, about 4 months before, 3 or 4 months before she died, she couldn't even make the stairs anymore. And so they took her and went out to clean her up, took the infirmary in the back of the other side of the thing because this disease was contagious. And so what they find there is these three manuscripts she had written, A, B, and C. Well, now Pauline is really upset. She's losing her little sister and stuff. And so the nun who helped clean out her room showed her these three booklets and left them there. She threw over there. Okay. That's the only reason we know about her. Like so many people, she would have disappeared in history. But when you read it, it's always fascinating. But anyway, and eventually she goes through a dark time. Then what happens is, and her teachings are wonderful. She wanted it all. She was somebody who had that big vision, but she also had to learn to accept what life really was offering you. We all want the idealistic thing, but we all have disappointments. And one of them was, so she's back there. They didn't have daily mass in those days, but the chaplain would come in 3 times a week and gave her communion. He gave her communion, and it was about 2 weeks into her being in the infirmary, and she spit it up. And we don't like Jesus to be get somehow messed up in the crap of the messiness of our own lives. And so he says, no more. So the last sense she had, now here's a gal who had hissy fits when she didn't go to the last sense she had that God was still reaching out to her was gone. It was in the Blessed Sacrament at that point. And so she says, well, it's a grace to receive the sacrament because I know you're there. But it's grace not to receive the sacrament because my longing for you is even more. See how she spinned it and received it? Then she says, because everything is grace. See, she by that time is that this world is permeated with grace. It's permeated with mercy. Grace is nothing but the divine presence. And she really understood that. And it was kind of wonderful. And so,
Father Bob,
yeah.
we are at the 10 o'clock mark, so I just want to invite people
Okay.
to stick on if you can for another 15 minutes, and then we will have to wrap up.
Okay. All right. Sorry about the timing, Miss. I didn't get that straight.
I
But
know
anyway,
you're very passionate about Therese.
I know. And I'll kind of I can end this here. Okay. But that's how they found out about her. And in fact, so eventually she does die, but she's great teaching is everything is grace. See, it's a graced universe, well before Faustina. So much so that by the end, you know what's one interesting thing, because a lot of the nuns thought their religious life was about saving themselves from hell instead of responding to this great love. So eventually she's writing back and forth, and eventually she writes this beautiful devotion divine, my divine mercy. And her spiritual director is saying, well, yeah, that looks nice, but you don't get room for hell. So she writes back, and then eventually she told the nuns and wrote him, he's in Canada by then, and says, yeah, well, okay, if the church teaches there's a hell, that probably is, but I know and believe it's empty. Well, they were scandalized. She heard it. In fact, three of them spoke against her beatification. What do you mean? Because that would our whole life is built on avoiding hell instead of our life is responding to great love that's always there, mercifully embracing us. She's way beyond like even where Faustina went. So that's probably a big thing. And of course, they found the book. Eventually, the nun finally said to Pauline one day, "What happened to those booklets?" And she had forgotten them. A month after she died. She did die at 7:20 on September 30th, 1897, and a very difficult death. She wasn't afraid of dying, but she was afraid of the suffering was getting a little much on her. But then eventually they find this book and then they get it going. So I'll end it there. That's her great gift. And I think as people read it, there's four original copies. We have one here in the museum in what here. And then uh and then if her uncle decided to publish it. They published 1,000 and 5,000, and everybody read it, and they were like, "Wow!" And the soldiers of World War One, especially the Australians, really one made her famous, and it continues because she permeates that thing. That she's always present. She will teach you to live in the presence of the moment, despite how dark it feels. That God is still there. That's that John of the Cross approach. That the whole ish way to get through the dark nights of physically, emotionally, spiritually is trust what's there. Even though you don't feel it, you're not getting any consolation, is trust the presence of the moment because God is always present deep within us and all around us. And that's why I think and ordinary people, the one of the ways I had to learn about her really was that when we brought the relics over, I said, what are you doing? Well, she made us all, we all could be holy. At that point, the church was at this point only special people, consecrated people, ordained people, or whatever. But it wasn't everybody. The daily life, everything, that God permeates every breath, every experience of our life. And that's what she really teaches us, and to trust it. No matter how light or darkness it feels, trust it's God. And that's what she taught me. My last closing line I just want to say is I didn't like her, like I say, and I took this job and I was trying to learn about her. But I eventually I've been diabetic most of my life, and I had a bad summer in '02, and anyway, and it was eating away my spinal cord. And eventually I was in bed there for a long time and had surgery, and I wasn't going to walk again. And I was laying in bed feeling sorry for myself, looking at a cross and saying, "You don't help Jesus." Then I said, "Therese, what about you? What about you? Well, how did you get through this? I'm reading your book. I'm trying to write your prayer books." And eventually instead of trying to tell me what I want to hear, I stayed still. And I distinctly heard this voice say, "Trust God." So I said, look where you are, look where I am. I'm not going to walk and you're in heaven. So I didn't talk for another week or two, but about 2 weeks later, I got tired of feeling sorry for myself. So went, and I said again, all I heard her say is trust God. And that was really the lesson. I wanted to learn to walk and my body did heal and stuff, and they did all that stuff. But I had to learn the real healing in my life, just as hers was a mother abandonment issue. I had, because of a sense of my dad, education, he'd been passed over. I'm his oldest boy. And I was a good student, but when I came home with four A's and a B, and all he'd ever say is, "Why'd you get a B?" I began to think I'm inadequate. Well, when you get in an inadequate mindset or false self in yourself, the personality like I have, you start pushing, and I become messianic. I'm going to save the world. I'm going to prove to everybody, and every person, every opportunity is a moment for me to prove myself. And what she said was, trust God. I had to learn the healing that really came from all that was not only could I walk again, but the healing was that the world could go on without me. There was a sense of humility and the simplicity of it all. I don't know if that makes sense to you, but that's the way I understand her and the way she certainly touched my life. And I can see people who come here. Okay. Any
Oh,
questions or
wow.
any concerns?
I we really appreciate this story and hearing your passion of Saint Therese and all of the lessons that she can share with us, especially that final piece, trust God, really resonated with me, especially in today's world. I think those are words to live by. And we thank you for your time this morning. So it was so good to see you, and it's so good to see all these familiar
Oh, it
faces.
is. It is. I love
And
it.
Vanessa, I'm going to ask you to please wrap us up with any last minute news we need.